She is a former economist, nutritionist with the United Nations and World Health Organization. The Coalition for Peace Action is delighted that you're attending our membership renewal gathering in support of our goals, and especially to honor and welcome our sister, brave voice for human rights. Please welcome the pint-sized person of passion and power, the indomitable Medea Benjamin.
So we have so many things happening in the Middle East and a series of wars or potential wars. And in the background of all of this is the low-grade warfare that the American public rarely hears about. And that's the drone warfare. And the drone warfare is really a way, I think, of keeping wars going behind the backs of the American people. And so you all who are part of a process of trying to move our country from one that is constantly using the hammer of the military to one that really uses diplomacy, have to focus, and I'm glad you are focusing, on this issue of drone warfare. When I was doing research for the book I wrote on drone warfare, there was very little information out, and the US government wasn't even admitting that we were using drones. And in the years since the Bush administration, it's been Obama's weapon of choice. And there were more drone strikes in the first year of the Obama administration than in 5 years of the Bush administration. And remember, Obama campaigned that he was going to close down Guantanamo? Not only has Guantanamo not been closed down, but the rationale was that it would look bad if we captured these people and then we put them into Guantanamo, because he said he was going to close Guantanamo. And they had a lot of meetings in the White House about it, and what they decided is it was just easier, cleaner, to just kill people. And that's why drone warfare has become so prevalent under the Obama administration. Now, for anybody who doesn't know much about drones, drones are just something flying in the air that has camera on it and is controlled remotely. And so there's all kinds of drones. There's drones that are the size of a hummingbird. There's drones that are the size of a big commercial airplane. And drones can be used for all kinds of positive purposes. It's not that the technology itself is bad. It's how we use it. You might have heard Jeff Bezos of Amazon saying he was going to deliver your packages by drone. Let's see how that works out, if they can figure out how to do it without somebody stealing the drone in the process or without it crashing on the way. But there are humanitarian uses for drones. There's drones tracking endangered species. There's drones that can be used for pinpointing forest fires, all kinds of uses internationally. And here in the United States, the U.S. airspace is supposed to be opened up to drones by the end of 2015. There will be some positive uses, commercial uses, but we should be very worried about the invasion of our privacy. And those issues are something that many groups across the ideological spectrum are very concerned about, and we can discuss a little bit what's happening on that front. But I wanted to focus on the drones that are being used for killing. And these drones are being used still quite extensively in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, were used in the Philippines. And there are drone bases that are being built up all across not only the Middle East, but also along the Pacific and in North Africa. And in the Middle East, one of the places that I am most concerned that there's a drone base is Saudi Arabia. Because you might remember one of the reasons that Osama bin Laden said he hated the United States is that we had US military bases in the Holy Lands. And one of the things that George Bush quietly did was actually to close the bases in Saudi Arabia. And now we have, under Obama, a new drone base being opened up in Saudi Arabia that will most likely mean blowback against us here at home. We have been told by the Obama administration, when they talk about the drones, that these are very effective weapons against terrorism and that very few innocent people have been killed. Well, They won't tell us how many people have been killed, and all we know is what's either put out by think tanks, non-governmental organizations that have tried to piece this together, or somebody like Lindsey Graham, who once blurted out, who has more access to inside information than we do, that he said last year that there were about 4,700 people killed by drones. In the case of Pakistan, there have been over 350 drone strikes, somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 people being killed in Pakistan alone, about 200 of them children. When the American people don't get a chance to hear about this, but there have been some exceptions. And one was the case of a family that got a chance to come to the United States. This family was from, well, they are from Pakistan. And this particular situation was one in which a 68-year-old grandmother, her name is Manama Bibi, was out in the fields picking okra with her grandchildren when a drone strike hit, and suddenly there was a loud noise, debris flying everywhere, shrapnel flying everywhere, screams. Manama Bibi was blown to bits, and 9 members of her family, the children, were rushed to the hospital. The drone that killed Manama Bibi was a mile away from the closest road. And the only thing that they could figure out is maybe they were trying to get some Taliban who was on the road. Well, this precision instrument was not very precise. Manama Bibi's husband is so distraught by this that he no longer talks. The children live in constant fear that they're going to be hit by a drone. And the 13-year-old grandson, when he came to the United States, he testified before Congress. And he said, "I no longer like blue skies. I prefer gray skies because drones don't fly when the skies are gray." And one of the things that compounded their problem is that nobody ever came to say what happened, why it happened. Nobody seemed to care. And a similar thing is in the case of another Pakistani who we met named Karim Khan. He works as a journalist and was away from his home in the tribal areas in northern Pakistan when he got called in the middle of the night and said that a drone had hit his household, that his son and his brother had been killed. And when he rushed home, he found out that his home had been blown to bits. And he said that his brother was a well-educated man who went back to the village to work in the local school precisely because there were a lot of Taliban in the region. And he wanted to teach the local children that education was much more powerful than weapons. And Karim Khan said, imagine the lesson these hundreds of students learned the night that a US drone killed their beloved teacher. Well, Karim Khan you might have heard of because recently he was invited to Europe to speak before the parliaments in Holland, the UK, and Germany. A week before he was scheduled to go, a bunch of men came in the middle of the night and dragged him away. His family had no idea where he was, what happened to him. And this global community that has been working against the drones mobilized immediately. And here in the United States, we sent thousands of phone calls into the State Department, to the Pakistani embassy, saying, produce Karim Khan and produce him alive. And the pressure was so intense that 9 days later, Karim Khan was let go. Not only, he said he was tortured while he was being kept by Pakistani military, but this man is so brave that he then got on a plane and continued his efforts to educate people in Europe about why drones are not the answer. One other case I wanted to mention to you was one in Yemen, where Tig and I and a group that went to Yemen to visit with drone victims were so taken with this man, Mohammed Al-Gawi, who we met. He was a very proud member of a large tribe in his area. And he told us the story about his brother who had been a teacher and moonlighting on the side to make more money for his family as a taxi driver. One day picked up two men, and a half hour later, his taxi was just a burning pile of metal. And when Muhammad went to the scene, he found just pieces of the body of his brother and the other two men. And he said maybe the other two men were members of Al-Qaeda, but nobody ever told him. And besides that, he said there were checkpoints in the road all the way. If somebody wanted to capture these people, they could have easily captured them. They didn't have to kill them with a drone. His brother left behind a wife and 3 young children who will never know their father, and left behind a whole tribe that is now extremely angry towards the United States. And Muhammad said to us that in his tribal culture, when you commit some kind of act, a crime or a terrible mistake, you have to do something about it. You have to acknowledge what you did, you have to apologize, and you have to compensate the family that you wronged. And he said, could it be that his tribal culture is more advanced when it comes to justice than the United States of America? It's not just the people who are getting killed, it's also that the drones are terrorizing entire populations. The Israelis have used the drones a lot in that tiny strip in Gaza. And when we went to Gaza the last time when we were able to get in, one of the young women said, it was like having a bee in your head that you heard the buzzing all the time, because they fly low enough that you can see and hear the drones. And she said, you always think that drone is meant for you. It's out to get you, that you're going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And you never know when and where that is. And so you are constantly fearful. And one young woman in Yemen who we met with said a very similar thing. And she said that in her province, there are 250,000 people, and this is the province where the drones are being used the most. She said, in your war on terror, you are terrorizing 250,000 people. And this thing about terrorizing entire populations was well documented in a study that was done by 2 very prestigious law firms, universities, one in Stanford and the other at NYU. They did a very extensive study called Living Under Drones. And they showed the psychological damage to entire populations because of the drones, and how it destroys the fabric of life in these communities, how people are afraid to go to community gatherings like this one, how they're afraid to go to the market, how parents are afraid to send their children to school because schools have been hit, how children are bedwetting and can't go to sleep at night because they're afraid a drone might hit their home during the night, and how people are afraid to go to funerals which have been targeted and weddings that have been targeted. And you might remember that not long ago, in fact it was just in December in Yemen, a wedding party was targeted. Now remember that who is looking at the targets are people right here in the United States. The drone operators, the drone pilots are here. And so they are looking at something thousands of miles away. And from thousands of miles away, a group of cars along a road in a place where the Al-Qaeda might be active looks like it's an Al-Qaeda convoy. And so they sent in the drones to attack that convoy, and what it was is a wedding party. So when our government says that only a handful of innocent people have been killed, that's just not true. And the other thing to understand is how ineffective the drones are just from the standpoint of saying, how do we get rid of Al-Qaeda? If you look at Yemen, in 2009, when the Obama administration started using the drones, there were maybe 200 members of a group called Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And now it's estimated that there are over 1,000 of them. When the journalists who study each drone strike look at the numbers, they say only 2% of those killed can be considered high level, either Al-Qaeda or Taliban. Only 2%. So who are the rest? Innocent people or low-level fighters. Now, I was in the home of a woman who told us that her 3 sons joined Al-Qaeda. And it was very jarring to hear that, because most of the people we met said, my loved one had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, wrong place, wrong time. You know, this was a woman who came out and said, my 3 children joined Al-Qaeda. Now, there's a whole background to that of what happened. It was under a dictatorship. The kids were mistreated. They joined Al-Qaeda because it was the only one they could find that was fighting the dictatorship. It had nothing to do with the United States. And she said, I think my children got in with the wrong gang. It was hearing like a mother saying, you know, in Los Angeles, my kids got in with the Crips. She said, but it had nothing to do with the U.S. So why should the U.S. come in and kill my children? What they needed was rehabilitation. What they needed was some direction in their lives. And instead, they were killed by a drone strike. So when we hear the word militant, think of those 3 young teenagers, because most of the people we're killing are young teenagers. Most of the people we're killing were maybe 10 years old at the time of the 9/11 attacks. And also, you should remember that the way that the administration had been defining militant was any male of military age that lived in the zones where we were using the drone strikes. So we have to question who we are killing and how much hatred we're creating in the process through these drone strikes. The other thing we have to question is the example we're setting for the rest of the world. If we can say that our president now can become prosecutor, judge, jury, executioner, that we can kill anybody we want, anywhere we want, because we have this technology, what happens when we are selling this technology around the world? And that's what we're doing. And that's what the Israelis are doing. And that's what the Chinese are doing. And that's what the South Africans are doing. And now there's about 800 companies that are making some sort of drones. And there are about 87 countries that already have some kind of drone. Most of them, the majority of them, are not weaponized drones yet. There's already 10 to 15 countries that are in the process of weaponizing the drones. And what they're doing also is making smaller and smaller drones that have smaller and smaller weapons on them, which almost guarantees that these will fall at the hands not only of other nation states, but non-nation states, groups like Al-Qaeda. So we are sowing the seeds for more and more violence in the process. And we are also totally violating international law. According to international law, you can use lethal force for self-defense when an attack is imminent. Imminent means right about to happen. Bombs are about to fall on you. Armies are amassed at your border. That you have to do this to stop those attacks. What the U.S. is now doing is using drone strikes against people who might someday, maybe, perhaps, attack us. That is not the definition of imminent. So with all of the problems that the U.S. is creating through the use of drone strikes, the positive side is that we're starting to change the conversation and we're starting to change the policy. So if you look at what has happened in the last 2 years, it's an incredible shift. You know, many of us in this room are old enough to know that usually when you're dealing with issues in war and peace or issues like nuclear weapons, it takes a long, long time to see the results of your work, which is why a lot of young people don't get involved in this, because they want to see immediate results for this stuff. But in the case of the drones, we're seeing a lot of changes in a short amount of time. When I started to do this work, I remember seeing a poll that was done in February of 2012, not long ago, that said that 83% of Americans thought it was just fine to use drones against terrorist suspects. And remember, a suspect is somebody who's never been convicted of anything. If you take those polls now, thank you, the results have been more like 60%, which is a significant drop in public support for the drones. Let's look at all the protests that are happening around the country, particularly at places where there are bases where the drones are either being operated or the training is happening. And we'll be talking, and Reverend Moore will give information about what is happening locally, which is really wonderful. But to understand that in places like Hancock, New York, and upstate New York, these people are just fabulous coalition that they've built, interfaith, mostly from the faith-based community, of people who have done this Gandhian wave of going to the Hancock base and getting arrested, and then the next wave getting arrested, and using their trials as a way to educate the public and get media attention to the crimes that are being committed in their communities. Because if your community is being used to train or to operate drones, you become a legitimate target. You become part of the battle. So there are really wonderful groups around the country have gotten involved in protests. And now there's weekly protests, not only at these bases, but at the CIA headquarters, at the Pentagon, at the corporate headquarters of the main drone maker in San Diego, General Atomics. The group Veterans for Peace is doing a weekly protest there. We have major protests that are happening in the places where we are using the drones, so in Pakistan, in Yemen. And we also, I just recently came back from Europe, where they are building up a great coalition of groups to say, we don't want the Europeans to be following suit like the United States. Now, Europe has been, as part of NATO in Afghanistan, using the drones. But the European community is trying to stop each country from getting its own weaponized drones. And there was a fabulous vote that just took place in February, a landslide vote in the European Parliament to prohibit the use of weaponized drones for the use of targeted assassinations, for saying we should ban targeted assassinations. We, the Europeans, should not be involved in it, nor should we aid anybody else who is using drones in this fashion. And the vote was 534 to 49. In Pakistan, they are using the court system. I mentioned this man, Karim Khan. One of the very brave things he did was to out the name of the CIA agent in Pakistan, because the CIA is in charge of the drones in Pakistan, and to charge him with murder. The CIA agent was forced to flee the country, and in various courts, including in the court, the higher court in the area known as Peshawar, they have already come down with in that court case saying that these drone strikes should be considered illegal, and the government must do something to stop the U.S. from using drones there. In the case of Yemen, where the president of Yemen has been in favor of the drone strikes because he gets a lot of money from the United States, after that wedding massacre that I mentioned that happened in December, the legislature in Yemen overwhelmingly voted to condemn drone strikes. There was just recently a group based out of the UK that's known as Reprieve, who took the case to the International Criminal Court. Now, the U.S. is not a signature of the International Criminal Court, so you can't take the U.S. there. So instead, they took the NATO countries to the International Criminal Court for NATO's complicity in the drone strikes. So these are some of the positive things that are happening, and the government has been forced, our government, to speak about this. Irene mentioned how I engaged President Obama when he was making his foreign policy address at the Defense University. And this address, he tried to justify the use of drones. And I had a chance to speak out on behalf of many of the families that I had met and said, will you apologize to the families of the innocent people who've been killed by our drones? Will you tell them that the lives of the Muslim people are as important as our lives are? Will you promise to abide by the rule of law? And one thing that he said is that this woman's voice is a voice that is worth listening to. I wish that he would. But he is starting to listen to the voices and the voices internationally. And so we are seeing that there are much fewer drone strikes happening now than in the past. If you look at 2010, in the case of Pakistan, there were 128 drone strikes. Last year, there were only 26. There are still a lot of drone strikes in the case of Yemen, but they are unfortunately, like the wedding party, way too many and killing too many innocent people. So our job is not done, but we are making inroads. We are seeing changes. We are forcing our government to stop using this weapon as the weapon of first resort. We are telling our government that if indeed they think somebody is engaged in activities that may harm Americans, then capture that person and give them the right to a fair trial. And so I want to end just by quoting two people. One is a woman that I met in Yemen, and I've just been so taken with young women that we meet in our travels overseas. And Yemen is a very, very conservative society. It's a society where just about all of the women you see walking down the street are totally covered with the niqab except for the eyes. And we met this young woman who is one of the youth representatives in her community. And she's one of the few women who is not covered, just wearing a headscarf. And people said, you've got to meet this woman because she was targeted by Al-Qaeda because she's a journalist. And she had the nerve to say that religion and politics are a terrible mixture and that religious people should really step aside when it comes to politics. And Al-Qaeda thought that was so awful that they produced a video showing this very beautiful woman turning into like the devil and put a fatwa on her head. And so she said she had to go underground for a year. And we said, well, what did you do? She said, well, I just put on the niqab. So nobody knew who she was. After a year, she felt comfortable enough to take it off. And I said, you must really hate Al-Qaeda and love the drones. And she said, on the contrary, I hate Al-Qaeda. I think they're a bunch of thugs. I think they're a bunch of criminals. But I also hate the drones. Because if somebody from Al-Qaeda was captured and put into prison, they would rot there in prison if they were found guilty. But when they're killed by a drone, they become a martyr. And not only did they become a martyr, their community then gets recruited to Al-Qaeda. And it justifies the terrible things that Al-Qaeda does. And she is part of this youth movement that's trying to envision a more democratic Yemen. And she said, in my view of a democratic Yemen, there will be no drones. Drones have no place in a democratic society. And I think we should take that young woman's words to heart and say that here in the United States, we say that drones have no place in a democratic society. So let me just then end on the note of the positive of seeing the democratic spark within our country that says it really doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or a Republican that is in the White House. We are not tethered to a political party. Amen. What we are tethered to is a moral compass. And if somebody in the White House is veering us away from that moral compass, it's our obligation to stand up. It's harder because were this happening under George Bush, we would have a lot more allies in this struggle. We would have the entire Progressive Caucus, which is the largest caucus in Congress, with us. We would have the very large grassroots base of the Democratic Party. We would probably have large demonstrations like we did under the Bush administration of tens of thousands of people coming out to say, hell no, we won't allow this to happen. Instead, we can't muster now a couple of hundred people to come out for this. But we are changing this not now through street action, but through other ways. And thank goodness now people in the religious community are coming out and saying, these are moral and ethical issues. We have to address this. And people in the universities are coming out and saying, we want to stop the ties between our university and the research money from the Pentagon that is going into more and more lethal ways of killing people. That's not the way we want our brightest minds in our engineering departments to put their energies. And so we have a real grassroots movement that has been building up now under this Obama administration to say it is not about President Obama, it's not whether or not you support him, it's about how you want to see us acting in the world, how you want to see us relating to people in the world, how you want us to see dealing with this issue of terrorism. And since one of the key issues of your organization is how do we put diplomacy in the forefront, the drones are keeping us from using diplomacy. The drones are guaranteeing a perpetual state of war. And even when the drone strikes are successful in killing one of the high-level people of our Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, they are counterproductive. And I'll just give one example, which is in Pakistan, November 1st, when the US was very excited because a drone killed the #1 person in the Taliban. The Pakistani government said, "What are you doing?" The next day, November 2nd, is when the peace talks were supposed to start. And now there are no peace talks, and now they've put an even harder line person in place. In fact, the person they put in place is the one who ordered the shooting of this 16-year-old girl, Malala Yousafzai, because she wanted to get an education. So drones are stopping us from looking for other ways to deal with terrorism, whether it's negotiations and peace talks and nonviolent ways to resolve conflicts, whether it's putting the massive amount of money we're putting into drones into things like education for people in Pakistan, supporting women's organizations so that they can fight against extremism in their own country. These are the kind of things that are going to change in the long term the fabric of societies, not drone strikes. So thank you for the work you're doing. Let's see our government turn around from one that uses weapons and militarism as a way to deal with problems to one that uses diplomacy first, second, and third. Thank you.